taking Blake's Christianity seriously, it's a slightly strange thing to say in a way, because at one level Blake is clearly Christian. It's even quite trivial to say so. But I guess the question is, what sort of Christian, and why might that matter to us now, 200 years on? And I hope to make the case that it does matter to us, and moreover, his kind of Christianity might actually be appealing now, given all that's happened, particularly religiously in the last 200 years. So let me plunge straight in and start to unpack this form of Christianity that I think Blake pretty clearly puts on display. Here is the last plate from one of his earliest publications, There Is No Natural Religion. And I wanted to put this on because right from the earliest days of Blake's sort of public voice, his public life, right through to the end, there is a theme, a consistent kind of Christianity that you can see running through, although I think he does very much develop it through the ups and downs of his own life. And this small booklet, There Is No Natural Religion, comes almost at the beginning of when he started producing his own work. And this sentence is really key. It's very, very telling. Therefore, God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. And the reference is, of course, to the incarnation, the central Christian insight that this person, historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was also the divine presence amongst us, Christ incarnate. But the way that Blake expresses that is deeply informed, in fact. And it's connected to a tradition that runs right through from the earliest days of Christianity, when the great fathers of the church, as Christianity was unpacking in the first 4 or 5 centuries, said something very similar indeed. So, for example, Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century said that the word of God became a man, so that from a man you might learn how to become a god. And then in the 3rd century, Cyril of Alexandria said, by dwelling in one, the world dwelt in all. And in the 4th century, Athanasius of Alexandria said, the Son of God became man so that we might become God. And then in the 5th, just to make the point, Leo the Great said, the descent of God to the human level was at the same time the ascent of man to the divine level. Now this chiming with early forms of Christianity is doubly interesting because it particularly, I think, draws a link between Blake's Christianity and the Christianity of the Eastern tradition within Christendom, that of Orthodoxy. That I say that because since the Reformation particularly, of course Blake lives a couple of hundred years after the Reformation, so very much in the aftermath of that shock across Western Europe. Since the Reformation, the theology of these early church figures has been pretty much sidelined. And what happened is, instead of emphasising the transfiguration and resurrection side of the incarnation, therefore God becomes as we are, that we might become as he is, the crucifixion and the separation of humanity from God came to be emphasised. And so the reformers, on the whole, tended to focus on a kind of salvation that emphasised an infinite abyss that had opened up between humanity and God. And that was what salvation was about. Moreover, there's even a little detail here that's worth noting. It's always worth noting in Blake's lines that although they can feel slightly strange and confusing to us, I think pretty much always every even tense is crucial. And here that's certainly so, because Blake says God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. This is not something that happened in the past, as it were 1800 years ago for Blake, 2000 years ago for us. This is the incarnation as an ongoing, eternal act that's happening even now. And this is something that's stressed much more again in Orthodoxy and in fact in mystical forms of Christianity in the West too, where this notion of deification can be found. And we know that Blake very much engaged with mystical writers such as Teresa of Avila. So he's emphasising that in using this present tense, God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. He's situating himself in a very particular part of the Christian tradition, certainly very different from the deism of his times, which was really the beginnings of the separation of a felt sense of an active, omnipresent participation in the divine life, that then in the 19th century and into our 20th and 21st century became atheism itself. As it were, God moved to the boundaries of human perception and then was able to fall away from very many people's perception anyway. And so the human form divine, as Blake famously puts it, could seem to become irrelevant, making way for people now to be able to read Blake, almost marginalising his Christianity or treating it as a kind of cultural optional extra that's not really crucial to his core message. But I think that it is. Now, tangible evidence for this link with orthodoxy is coming actually in a forthcoming book published by Palgrave Macmillan. I think it's going to be called Blake and Jesus. And in particular, one of the contributors is a great teacher of mine on Blake, Suzanne Sklar. And she, in her contribution to that book, presents tangible evidence that Blake was exposed to Eastern Orthodoxy in London at the time. One of the links comes because the Moravians, of which his mother was a part, they took their route into the Christian tradition via Orthodoxy rather than via the Protestant traditions or Catholicism. And that is sort of documented as well. So that's one way in which Blake might have known about orthodoxy. But also Suzanne charts how throughout his life in London, he would have lived within just a few minutes walking distance of Orthodox chapels that had opened up, and indeed were actively engaging with the philosophers and thinkers of the time. And that seems very likely then that Blake would have seen icons in these Orthodox chapels, and hence showing this picture of the Virgin in Child by Blake, which of course looks very icon-like. If you know what an icon of the Virgin in Child looks like in the Orthodox tradition, you can immediately see resonance with Blake's rendition of it here. And moreover, of course, icons are known in this tradition as windows on eternity, and particularly in the latter part of Blake's understanding of Christianity, this notion of eternity becomes absolutely fundamental. We'll have more to say about that. For now, just to sort of honour the title of my talk, Jesus the Imagination, not actually a phrase that Blake directly uses, but the link's often made in work on his Christianity. Jesus is the imagination because of the incarnation. That is making explicit in history what's eternally true and perceivable through the imagination. That the substantial world around us is also entirely spiritual. That Jesus as a human person was also a divine body, as we indeed are members of the divine body, as Blake puts it, a notion which he would have found from the writings of St. Paul, as well as no doubt perceiving it himself. Jesus, the human imagination, therefore, is perfectly coincident with the divine vision. Vision being another hugely important Blakean word, of course, but the human imagination, when discerned, when free, when aligned, knows of the divine vision as well. And that's a notion that's implicit in the Christian affirmation that the incarnation in Jesus is as one who's both fully God and fully human, to which we as well can aspire. Jesus, you might also say then, with this link of the human and the divine, is a full instantiation of one of the great themes of Blake's works, which is the contraries of innocence and experience, of course, but also the finite and the infinite, the mortal and the eternal, death and life even. Another really important part of Blake's understanding of Christianity, which we'll return to. So that's to say something about Blake's early account of Christianity, particularly focusing, I think, on the incarnation and this understanding that therefore God becomes as we are so that we might be as he is. But I wanted to turn now to the latter part of Blake's work. This is plate 4, when the great epic poem Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion begins, probably written in the 1810s, the 1820s, towards this certainly well into the second half of Blake's life. He printed it probably in about 1819, and there you can see similar themes developed in this later work. You can call it, I think, Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, his kind of mature account of Christianity, but the same account is there. So just note some of the famous texts. I'll read a little bit from the middle section of this plate 4, when Blake writes, "Awake, awake, O sleeper of the land of shadows, wake, expand. I am in you, and you in me, mutual in love divine. I'm not a god afar off, I'm a brother and friend. Within your bosoms I reside, and you reside in me." This powerful sense that the transcendent is actually known immanently, that the two are coincident when we follow this golden string which he so much promises to offer us in Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion. There's also really important details to notice again, a bit like the becomes in the present tense. And I hope you can just about see in this reproduction of the plate the detail at the top, which is a bit of Greek, and it reads monos ho Jesus, which means alone with Jesus. And this is a quote from the Bible that occurs in two places, one in the Synoptic Gospel, so that's Mark, Matthew and Luke, and then once also in John's Gospel. And in the Synoptics, it occurs in the story of the Transfiguration. And in the Transfiguration, the story that Peter, James and John go up the mountain with Jesus, and he's transfigured before them. And then after Elijah and Moses have disappeared, they're left alone with Jesus. And so it's a nod to how, when we understand the presence of Jesus and this notion of becoming so that we might become as God, what you know is material life, embodied life, this life, through this divine imagination, as it truly is, which is radiating the divine. This is the story of the Transfiguration, a kind of glimpse of eternity known in this life. So monos ho Jesus is a reference partly to the Transfiguration, giving you a sense of Blake's understanding of these things. But then there's also in John's Gospel this phrase, monos ho Jesus, as well. And this comes in a different story. It's the story which only appears in John's Gospel of the woman caught in adultery. Here's one of the images that Blake presented of a biblical story to Thomas Butts, and it's of this story. It tells a particular moment in the story, which Blake clearly does to emphasise a point. You'll know that she's brought before Jesus with her accusers, and then Jesus writes in the sand and then makes this famous utterance, "The one without sin can cast the first stone." And at that point, her accusers turn and move away, realising that their trick on Jesus has tricked them. And there's this incredibly poignant moment where Jesus is left with the woman. And Blake has painted this so as to emphasise the moment where the woman herself, you might say, is still in between life and death. Jesus is writing in the sand. He, of course, at least in the mythology, is the one without sin, and so could still yet cast the first stone. She doesn't yet know her fate. She's caught in this contrary. But of course, Jesus himself is caught in this contrary too, in between life and death. His accusers are out to get him. And in John's Gospel, he's very clear that he knows that his fate lies on the cross. And so actually, this is an identification between Jesus and the woman caught in adultery that Blake is painting here. She is seeing in the encounter with Jesus, and Jesus is showing her. Some have even said, even by Jesus painted by Blake as bowing towards her, as knowing the human form divine in her too, as well as in Jesus. God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is, through the eyes of the imagination. A tremendous moment that Blake is emphasising and then linking back with this phrase, monos ho Jesus, the centrality of these things for him. Back to Jerusalem and plate 4. Jesus, you might say, pervades throughout the whole poem. Throughout, there's this spirit of the continual forgiveness of sins, as Blake puts it, that keeps returning like a kind of pulse through all the shenanigans and the ups and downs of loss and his spectre, of Vala and Jerusalem and so on, of Albion falling and despairing once again. But he's also present in the sense of the Saviour's kingdom, as Blake calls it, or the divine body is present, but also in particular moments as well. And the divine Saviour appears several times throughout the poem at certain low moments, often Albion's low moments, but also at Jerusalem's low moments as well. Jerusalem is the divine aspect, you might say, of Albion, the hero really of the poem, hence Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. And she constantly tries to revive Albion's spirit, to revive his eternal perception, and repeatedly fails to do so, and so enters into the kind of fallen state herself, which of course is what Jesus does at the moment of the incarnation. But there's a section when Jesus, the divine Saviour, talks with Jerusalem, and I wanted to emphasise that now. Jesus, in this other image, not from the great poem, of course, but one of the illustrations to the Night Thoughts, emphasising the wounds of Jesus, and so entering into eternal death. Jesus comforts Jerusalem in Jerusalem, the nation of the giant Albion, and says these things when Jerusalem starts to despair. Here's the section. But Jerusalem faintly saw him, closed in the dungeons of Babylon. Her form was held by Beulah's daughters, but all within unseen. She sat at the mills, her hair unbound, her feet naked. Cut with the flints, her tears run down, her reason grows like the wheel of hand, incessant turning day and night without rest. Insane she raves upon the wind's horse, inarticulate. All night Vala hears, she triumphs in pride of holiness, to see Jerusalem deface her lineaments with bitter blows of despair, while the satanic holiness triumphed in Vala, in a religion of chastity and uncircumcised selfishness, both of the head and heart and loins, clothed up in moral pride. But the divine Lamb stood beside Jerusalem. Oft she saw the lineaments divine, and oft the voice heard, and oft she said, O Lord and Saviour, have the gods of the heathen pierced thee? Or hast thou been pierced in the house of thy friends? Art thou alive, or livest thou for evermore? Or art thou not, but a delusive shadow, a thought that liveth not? Babel mocks, saying, There is no God, nor Son of God, that thou, O human imagination, O divine body, art all a delusion. But I know thee, O Lord, when thou arisest upon my weary eyes, even in this dungeon and this iron mill. The stars of Albion cruel rise, thou biddest to sweet influences, for thou also sufferest with me, although I behold thee not. And although I sin and blaspheme thy holy name, thou pitiest me, because thou knowest I am deluded by the turning mills, and by these visions of pity and love, because of Albion's death. Thus spake Jerusalem, and thus the divine voice replied, Mild shade of man, pitiest thou these visions of terror and woe? Give forth thy pity and love. Fear not. Lo, I am with thee always. Only believe in me that I have power to raise from death. And the power to raise from death is shown towards the end of the poem when Albion finally awakens. First of all, resurrected by the divine breath or spirit. And this is the vivified Britannia. And Britannia is the reunion of Jerusalem and Vala, who've become so horribly divided through the poem. And Britannia breathes in the spirit upon Albion's breast, and he starts to stir. This is how Blake describes it. This is an image from slightly earlier in the poem, which is Jerusalem herself awakening. And then subsequently the spirit breathes in this way, as Blake describes it. Her voice pierced Albion's clay cold ear. He moved upon the rock. The divine breath went forth upon the morning hills. Albion moved upon the rock. He opened his eyelids in pain. In pain he moved his stony members. He saw England. Ah, shall the dead live again? The breath divine went forth over the morning hills. Albion rose in anger, the wrath of God breaking bright on all sides around his awful limbs. into the heavens he walked, clothed in flames. So that's Albion awakening through the divine breath, through Jerusalem. And then in the second part of this great resurrection scene, Jesus, loss, and then Albion himself are identified with Jesus, this incarnational notion. And this is how Blake describes it. Then Jesus appeared standing by Albion as the good shepherd, by the lost sheep that he hath found. And Albion knew that it was the Lord, the universal humanity. And Albion saw his form, a man, and they conversed as man with man in ages of eternity. And the divine appearance was the likeness and similitude of loss. So this is all to say that there's a mystical Christianity deeply informing Blake's Christianity, and especially, I think, this notion of deification focused on the identification with the figure of Jesus, who is this timeless through the imagination, and by timeless I mean constant and continual in time, recognition of the human form divine. But if you're persuaded that's Blake's understanding of Christianity, there's a good question to ask, which is, so how does this come about? And Blake explains, I think, also, he unpacks the stance that brings about this deification. And two features are particularly important: the continual forgiveness of sins, which I've already alluded to, and also a notion of self-annihilation, as Blake calls it, which particularly becomes important in the latter part of his work. Here's one of Blake's images of Jesus' resurrection appearance. So think first of all about forgiveness. And what forgiveness is about, I think, is not the need to remove sin, as Protestant substitution theory suggests, that Jesus had to die in order to take our punishment, but in order rather that moment by moment we might be free to respond to the divine presence that's all around us. Forgiveness, if you like, has already happened. What needs to happen subsequently is for us acceptance of that forgiveness that then liberates us, frees us to be in the divine presence moment by moment, this continual act of incarnation. And Blake summarises this in a section from the Everlasting Gospel, this long poem he was working on, never published, but contains some real gems in terms of his understanding of things. So let me read a section from that. It goes like this. What can this gospel of Jesus be? What life and immortality? What was it that he brought to light that Plato and Cicero did not write? The heathen deities wrote them all, these moral virtues, great and small. What is the accusation of sin but moral virtues, deadly gin? The moral virtues in their pride did o'er the world's triumphant ride. In wars and sacrifice for sin, and souls to hell ran trooping in. The accuser, holy God of all, this Pharisaic worldly ball, amidst them in his glory beams upon the rivers and the streams. So that's, in a way, a condemnation of the old notion of Christianity and how it really condemns people to hell. But then Blake continues and says, Then Jesus rose and said to me, Thy sins are all forgiven thee. Loud Pilate howled, like Caiaphas yelled, when they the gospel light beheld. Jerusalem, he said to me, it was when Jesus said to me, Thy sins are all forgiven thee. The Christian trumpets loud proclaim through all the world in Jesus' name, mutual forgiveness of each vice, and opened the gates of paradise. The moral virtues in great fear formed the cross and nail and spear, and the accuser standing by cried out, Crucify, crucify. The crucifixion is because of this world not being able to accept forgiveness. It's not the means of forgiveness. Blake completely inverting things there in order to emphasise this mystical, continual possibility of stepping into eternity. You see this in one of the best-known images of Christ crucified by Blake in Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. And notice here that it's as much a transfiguration as it is a crucifixion, with the light and maybe the fruit on the trees too. And of course, the figure before, maybe Los, maybe Albion, imitating Christ, beginning to know in themselves of this light, of this true nature of our embodied existence. And this gives me the chance to think about self-annihilation as well, because I think it's not about a kind of overcoming of the ego as we might think of it now. I mean, the ego wasn't even really invented 200 years ago. It's not really till Freud that we started talking about egos in this way. I think it's something slightly different. It's really the continual overcoming of the sense that we're separate, that somehow we're not intimate with the divine, that when we hear phrases like I'm in you, you're in me, mutual in love divine, we think skeptically, how can that possibly be? And the overcoming of that sense of separation, therefore, is the self-annihilation and all that involves. I mean, Blake goes into what that separation amounts to throughout his work, particularly in the figure of lost Urizen, when Urizen figures that he can step out on his own, losing touch with the other Zoas, and descending into these fallen states that Blake so vividly describes. We perhaps know it more personally with these dialogues with our spectre, the reasoning mentality that tries to persuade us we can work it out, we are self-sufficient, that our pride is what we need and we should distrust anything that might be related to or connected with beyond ourselves. And Blake in Jerusalem has Jesus addressing that concern, but through the notion of self-annihilation, which is the stepping out of that separate self into a wider possibility, which Jesus puts like this when he speaks to Albion. Jesus replied, "Fear not, Albion, unless I die, thou canst not live. But if I die, I shall rise again, and thou with me. This is friendship and brotherhood. Without it, man is not." So Jesus spoke. The covering cherub coming on in darkness overshadowed them. And Jesus said, "Thus do men in eternity, one for another, to put off by forgiveness every sin." Albion replied, "Cannot man exist without mysterious offering of self for another? Is this friendship and brotherhood? I see thee in the likeness and similitude of loss, my friend." Jesus said, "Wouldest thou love one who never died for thee, or ever die for one who had not died for thee? And if God dieth not for man, and giveth not himself eternally for man, man could not exist. For man is love, as God is love." So self-annihilation, this stepping back into love, which can feel like a kind of death when you've been trusting the spectre, when the spirit of Urizen has seized the whole culture, and yet actually it's a stepping into more. And I think Blake actually found a lot of his inspiration for this understanding of Christianity, not perhaps just through his connections with the Orthodox and so on, but also in his reading of the Bhagavad Gita. This was translated into English in the 1780s, and Blake was one of the first readers. He painted a portrait of Charles Wilkins, the translator here you can see. He also drew images of the Brahmins, and I think in many ways you can spot how details in Blake's work show that he knew the Gita, the name Vala being one of them, a sort of play on the notion of Maya or ignorance and veiling, but also in his understanding of Christianity, because in the Gita it's very clear that there's a kind of understanding of self-annihilation that would appeal to Blake, which is to throw all that you have into what you're doing, but without worrying about the consequences. It's giving what you have to the moment, but letting that moment then become part of a much wider unfolding. And that is what stepping into eternity is about. His vision is one that can embrace without the need to exclude other traditions as well, you might note. This is a kind of understanding of Christianity that's deeply commodious and understands that the human imagination, the divine vision, is operative throughout the world. How could it be otherwise if you believe in a monotheistic God? And so finding inspiration in the Bhagavad Gita, I think, came quite naturally to Blake. And it'd be lovely to know what his annotations were on his copy, given that he had one. We don't know that. And yet I think you can see these traces and this spirit coming back into his account of Christianity. So look, so something about forgiveness and something about self-annihilation. But let me just ask again, why are these elements so crucial? What's going on here? Here you can see a plate from Milton, another one of the longer poems from the second half of Blake's life. There's this figure approaching Urizen with his tablets of stone, and Blake's even drawn it so that the foot cuts through selfhood quite deliberately in the design. And then you can see the delight in eternity with the figures there, the celestial beings playing their musical instruments. As you'll know from the illustrations to Job, it's very important in Blake that musical instruments are being played, not just hanging on trees. And the point is that this selfhood and its denial lets in eternity into the present moment. Generation, just the cyclical repeat sense of life which we otherwise have in generation, can become regeneration. It can become this sort of kairotic cut through chronological time, and so that every moment can become known as something new. Beulah, not just being a rest place from the tension of contraries like life and death, can become actually a portal or a gateway, a threshold into eternity. As Blake describes it, Beulah is wrapped around eternity. And this then is another way of talking about how the incarnation is continuous. As Blake puts it in Milton in this wonderful, wonderful summary of things, he says, there is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find. And just as a side, Satan here is the name for the state that is opaque, that is limited, that doesn't understand the pregnancy of every moment. So there's a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it, but the industrious find it, this moment, and it multiply. And when it is once found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. This invitation to understand what's going on here. And it's not just the human form divine that might become regenerated and multiplied and renovated if this moment is rightly placed when the industrious find it. The whole of nature will too. Milton is full of delightful accounts of what it's like to see the natural world, the creatures, even the bugs and the flies and so on, from the perspective of eternity. And in this final image, which shows Ololon in this cruciform figure, she too is identified with Jesus in Milton. But also these plants, which have now taken on the human form as divine as well, they know of their intelligence and so become part of this incarnational moment as well. This is something which Blake understood, because for him the word men or man, or of course woman as well, doesn't refer primarily to the genders, although it can. It's drawn from the same root as mind or mentality, and so it's knowing of the divine logos, the divine intelligence, the divine creativity in all things, and hence he can talk about stars and comets and mountains and streams and rivers and plants and so on, all appearing as men. It's code for saying that intelligence awakens them to this incarnation as well. So look, why should we be bothered by this today? If you buy this vision and think it is tremendous, then why is it still relevant? If you're wary of Blake's Christianity, thinking it was something that belonged to the Georgian period but really can't belong to us now because of all that's happened in between times, Blake addresses that question too. And I wanted to take you back to this early publication, There Is No Natural Religion, to begin to tease at least some of that now. Essentially, Blake has a critique of the naturalism, as we now call it, which is the doctrine that the natural sciences are the best and really preeminent ways of understanding the truth of things, physics, chemistry and biology and so on. And of course they would say that we live in a closed cosmos that is, even with the subtleties of quantum theory, is nonetheless mechanical, is inert, is not alert, is not intelligently responding. Blake, I think, saw this coming and had some very powerful and punchy arguments as to why this just couldn't be so. There is no imagination in a closed system universe, of course. It just imagines that we're kind of lighthouse minds beaming out meaning, beaming out beauty, beaming out intelligence. But really it's just a sort of failed effort to awaken things. But Blake, he makes this sort of epistemological point and says that if the senses, the empirical senses, were all that we had, that wouldn't be enough to understand things, to resonate with the cosmos, to receive the intelligence that our intelligence can then pick up. Because facts alone are not enough. They don't bring insight. There's always the need for this wider understanding and knowing with which we can become attuned. And Blake unpacks it in this plate 4 from There Is No Natural Religion, when he says, the bounded is loathed by its possessor. The same dull round, even of a universe, would soon become a mill with complicated wheels. Of course, that notion of the cosmos as a bit like a mill with complicated wheels is the popular sense of things, at least. And it becomes, Blake argues, as just a dull round, deadening, leading to despair, to alienation, to isolation, and then, of course, back to selfhood and spectre and to Eurozenic ways of life, and so deepening the fall. The bounded cosmos is loathed by its possessor. We turn out rejecting what we otherwise try to enlighten with our kind of lighthouse minds. But there's also an anthropological point, and this becomes a kind of critique of consumption. And remember, mercantilism is getting going in Blake's day. Figures like Adam Smith noticed how it was a once weighing people down, but was sort of a necessary trick in order to kickstart progress. But Blake is deeply suspect of that, not because we shouldn't want more and more, but because we must want it in the right way. And he explains this in the 5th plate with, I think, a very, very brilliant couple of lines summary of things. When Blake says, if the many become the same as the few when possessed, more is the cry of a mistaken soul, less than all cannot satisfy man. So what he's saying here is, if the many, and I think that means the sort of many trinkets, the many things that a mercantile culture increasingly offers us to buy, if the many become the same as the few when possessed, so the idea is that we can only have a few of these many things on offer, but we kind of get caught in this consumptive headmill, constantly buying a few more of the many, as if that's the kind of goal of life. Blake says, no, more, the kind of cry of the consumptive life, is actually the cry of a mistaken soul. But what then he then adds is that to say, okay, we should consume less, we should sort of limit the economy, have zero growth, try and factor in ways of living like that. Blake says no, he feels that's a terrible mistake as well, because the truth is that with this meeting of the divine and the human within us, we do have infinite desire. The question is, are we trying to satisfy it by more, or, as he concludes in the plate, less than all cannot satisfy man? We must relearn this mystical Christianity, Blake is saying, and so know of, through our imaginations, of the incarnation within us, that we in our finitude can know of infinitude, and our transient and temporal state can know of eternity. These things, as it were, sit one within the other. So you might summarize by that by saying that humanity without transcendence, without an immanent experience sense of that notion, without the imagination not just as something that comes out of us, but rather that floods into us, with which we can then respond, we become spectrous, we become Eurozenic. And it's, many of the problems which we did today, which is why this vision of Blake's is not just one for 200 years ago, but is so pressing now, I think. And this is what happens when we forget this immanent divinity within us. Here's the famous image of Los conversing with the spectre at the beginning of Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. The spectre trying to persuade Los that together they can work it out. But what it really leads to is this, which Blake describes at the beginning of the great poem when he says, but the perturbed man away turns down the valleys dark, saying, we are not one, we are many, thou most simulative phantom of the overheated brain, shadow of immortality, seeking to keep my soul a victim to thy love, which binds man, the enemy of man, into deceitful friendships. Jerusalem is not, her daughters are indefinite. By demonstration man alone can live, and not by faith. My mountains are my own, and I will keep them to myself. The Malvern and the Cheviot, the Wolds, Philhinnon and Snowdon are mine. Here will I build my laws of moral virtue. Humanity shall be no more, but war and princedom and victory. Blake routinely came to stress the wastes of moral law, this kind of substitute for a living, vital experience of the divine, turning it into a kind of code, which is what deism did and which cultural Christianity now broadly does. And for Blake, that means that humanity shall be no more. Removing this lived experience of the divine and Jesus, the imagination, is anti-humanistic. It's not humanism as we often refer to it now. It's precisely the opposite. And what it leads to is war, princedom, and the quest for victory. Possessiveness. By demonstration alone shall man live. And this extraordinarily prescient remark, phantom of an overheated brain. And of course, now when you read about religion, you're barely 2 pages away from some kind of neuroscan saying precisely that. There's other reasons why this divine experience is needed, and it's not just for our own humanity, but I think it's for our relationship with the natural world. I touched on it when you saw that earlier image from the end of Milton with Olilon identified with Jesus, and then also the plant world itself identified with the divine intelligence. And this is about understanding our relationship to the natural world, not just by stewardship or guardianship, which is the sort of trend now, you might say, because the problem with this is that this is a kind of moral understanding of the crisis, an instantiation of virtues, which just actually leads to guilt. Because we constantly fail if moral standards are what we're judging ourselves by. And then, of course, blame kicks in, all sorts of squabbles and so on. It divides humanity, the waste of the moral law. Now, what Blake's saying is that we need a participative, a communing with the natural world, an understanding that we have a shared ontology. And that being, that ontology, is shared in this triangular way. Our intelligence, the different intelligences of the many around us are one because there are as many manifestations of the divine intelligence. There are as many reflections and echoes of the divine life that is within us and all things, this transcendence that's immanent. That is what we need to understand, Blake would said. And without that comes split, comes division, comes burdensome insistences on moral demands and so on, the kind of guilt that becomes Eurozenic and takes us away from the divine. We need a shared identification with God, without a loss of diversity, though, without a loss of difference. As Coleridge put it, there can be distinction without difference. So we can know of the many things when we realise that they're all as many variant sharings in the one thing. That's another reason why this triangulation is so necessary. Blake celebrates it in the famous poem which he wrote to Thomas Butts when they moved for that short period down to Feltham. I'll read it out now. And just note, again, when he talks about men, he's talking about this mentality, this intelligence, this divine life that's in all things. And Blake writes, "My first vision of light on the yellow sand sitting, the sun was emitting his glorious beams from heaven's high streams, over sea, over land. My eyes did expand into regions of air, away from all care, into regions of fire, remote from desire. The light of the morning, heaven's mountains adorning, in particles bright, the jewels of light distinct shone and clear. Amazed and in fear, I each particle gazed, astonished, amazed, for each was a man, human-formed. Swift I ran, for they beckoned to me, remote by the sea, saying, each grain of sand, every stone on the land, each rock and each hill, each fountain and rill, each herb and each tree, mountain, hill, earth and sea, cloud, meteor and star, are men seen afar. I stood in the beams of heaven's bright beams." So that reference there to man is also a reference to this incarnational understanding of Christianity, expanded now, so that standing in the streams of heaven's bright beams, I should have said, becomes a possibility through this triangulation. Just to touch on a couple of other reasons why this might matter, and I'll begin to draw to a close, and I hope this is prompting lots of questions and thoughts. I think sentiment won't be enough either. Blake particularly explores what now we think of as empathy, altruism, solidarity. These words weren't actually invented in Blake's time. They come in the 19th century and then the 20th century when deism becomes atheism, and there's a sense of needing to revive human sentiment in order to try and achieve what a sense of oneness in the divine life might have brought to us before. But I think Blake saw through this coming notion of empathy and so on, because he recognised that it divides quite as much as it unites. What was going on there was the beginnings of what's now called the hallucination theory of consciousness. So this is the idea that our brain, our bodies generate perceptions of the world, having received the imprints from the empirical senses, and then project out that awareness, that perception onto the world around us, hence the notion of hallucination. And if we're lucky, sometimes those hallucinations do actually meet, as it were, reality, and then we have a sense of connection. But Blake was right onto this and said this kind of pity, as he puts it, divides the human soul as much as it unites it, because we're only really always stuck with our own sense of things and a faint sort of promise of communion when our own sense of things happily coincides, but in the next moment it won't coincide, and so we're left with this kind of tussle of union and then division if we're to rely on what became notions like altruism and empathy and solidarity. I put two here images from the first book of Urizen, and which I think contrast, on the one hand, what Blake feared would be coming through reliance on sentiment and sympathy instead of the sacred and the divine vision. There's this image of Urizen locked in himself, in his mind, and so therefore chained to the ground. But there's not many moments of hope in the first book of Urizen, but there is right at the beginning with this lovely image, probably of the soul being guided through life, which is this gold, lovely brilliance, certainly in this reproduction, being guided by a kind of celestial vision, an image of communion and unity rather than separation and enchainment. These theories are really worth thinking through that we have now, and I think that Blake has a lot to say to them. That's another reason why we need this Christian vision now, I think. Penultimate point, I think that we also need this because of what happened in the meantime. I think that in the 19th century, part of what happened that separated Blake's understanding of Christianity from our own times was that, as Feuerbach put it in his famous book about the Christian religion, translated into English by George Eliot, that all theology is actually anthropology. All theology is actually anthropology. And so Feuerbach spells out the modern sort of assumption, the skeptical critique, atheist critique of belief in God, that actually it's just a projection from our inner lives onto the cosmos. And so anything we might say about God is really just a reflection on our own humanity, lost, cut off, not part of transcendent life. Of course, Feuerbach didn't put it like that. He thought that this was progress. But Blake is saying, as it were, ahead of time, no, all anthropology is actually theology. That when we reflect on our humanity, we discover the divine life, and that is how we can know within ourselves, in our finitude, that there's an infinite abyss within us. That's how we can know in our temporal lives that every moment is cut through by eternity. And I think this explains why Blake in the Everlasting Gospel has what can seem like a rather paradoxical line when he says, God is no more, thy own humanity learn to adore, sometimes cited as if Blake actually is anticipating a kind of atheistic humanism. I think actually what's going on there is this is God in God's self saying to Jesus, as Jesus is about to enter historical time in the incarnation, what your task is now is to forget, as it were, God the Father and know of God the Son within your humanity. And so this is the incarnation again, that God becoming as we are so that we may be as he is. It's actually quite a common sentiment amongst the mystics that the God that's afar off, the God that is deemed to be transcendent, the God that is not intimately involved in our lives, that God must die. God is no more. And thy only humanity therefore learn to adore, because that awakens the fullest sense of the divine life in the divine vision that's also the human imagination. So to come to a close, You know, the apocalyptic in Blake too is remade along these lines. As he puts it, the apocalyptic is the truth realised moment by moment through the forgiveness of sins, through self-annihilation, through living at this point in which eternity cuts through time, at which generation becomes regeneration. The contraries of the finite and the infinite don't take us from eternity, but actually are precisely the stepping stone into eternity. As Blake puts it, the apocalypse is when any individual rejects error and embraces truth. A last judgment passes upon that individual. And just to draw to a close with this lovely image again, I think at Thomas Butts' commission of the end of Mark's Gospel, which shows the three Marys approaching the tomb and the angel saying, "He's not risen, he's not here, he has arisen." And the three Marys, as the Gospel in its original form, end afraid. I think Blake would have loved this, because this is precisely the moment of possibility, the moment when it's possible to step into eternal vision, the moment that, I think according to Blake's Christianity, is every moment for us. And he, in his poetry and in his understanding, this deep reception, I think, of the mystical forms of Christianity, making him, to my mind, one of the most important post-Reformation mystics in the Western world. That is what he offered his times, and I think still offers for us now, needed even more so, I think you might well say.